Okay, let's get started. Welcome to the May 2021 Food Thinkers from the Centre for Food Policy. Our 2020-21 Food Thinkers seminar series brings together big ideas from women in academia, policy, business, and advocacy on redesigning food systems. And today I'm delighted to welcome Alana Mann to talk about food in a changing climate from the University of Sydney in Australia, where, by the way, it's 2:20 in the morning. So thank you very much for joining. And my name is Professor Corinna Hawkes. I'm director of the Centre for Food Policy, the host of the Food Thinkers seminars, webinars, and I'm delighted to host Alana and to host today's session. So first of all, a little bit of just some information about today. This webinar is being recorded. It will be available online afterwards in our YouTube channel. We will have a 40-minute or so talk followed by questions. And we do encourage a lot of questions, and we do often get a lot of questions. It's always great that we have such a wonderfully engaged audience. That does mean it's best if you start posting your questions as soon as you have them into the Q&A, please. Not into the chat, but into the Q&A. And then I will moderate those questions and ask Alana, who will then answer them. And we, of course, always try and ask all of the questions, though sometimes that isn't always possible. This is Food Thinkers. We invite people in with big ideas to share. We want you to engage, think, reflect. So that's the focus. If you do, however, decide that you want to tweet something out about this session, you are most welcome to, and we like that too. And the hashtag is Food Thinkers, and our handle is @FoodPolicyCity. This is the first in 2 talks about climate. We've got Alana today, and on June the 29th, we will be welcoming Christina Hicks of Lancaster University, who will be talking about the vulnerability of small-scale fisheries to climate change and bringing in the nutrition element of fisheries as well. If you want to learn about our regular series, please do sign up for our monthly newsletter if you're not already, and our updates. And you can do that by sending a message in the chat to the panelists, so it doesn't go to everybody, with your name and email address. We are getting a lot of inquiries about our master's program in food policy at this point in time in our short course. So we will stick into the chat the link, so you can follow that through if necessary. So welcome to Alana, who's Associate Professor in the Faculty of Arts and Social Sciences at the University of Sydney and a researcher in University's Sydney Environment Institute. And Alana is a fantastic communicator and researcher, really trying to think about the big ideas in the food system. And she focuses on the communicative dimensions of citizen engagement, participation, and collective action in food systems planning and governance. And this past February, she published her latest book, Food in a Changing Climate, which is her 3rd book. Other books include Voice and Participation in Global Food Politics a couple of years earlier, and Global Activism in Food Politics on Power in 2014. So we're really delighted to welcome you to, today, Alana, and you're going to talk about climate change, and in the context of the climate emergency that we're all very, very conscious of. Take us through some of the big issues here about the discourses and narratives that might promote technological solutions, and talk about changing consumption practices and the kind of the standard things which are proposed, and in the context of countries wanting to address climate change, and perhaps argue some perhaps different approaches that reflect your current and earlier thinking might be needed. So no further ado, over to you, Alana.
Thanks so much, Corinna. And I'd really like to thank you personally, but also, of course, the Centre for Food Policy, City University of London, for hosting this talk. It's lovely to join you all. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, whatever it is for you. In Australia, it's a lovely crisp winter's morning, very early. So thanks for that lovely introduction, Corinna. It is actually a talk that sums up a lot of the themes in the book, and a lot of them connect with work I've done previously. I started my academic career studying La Via Campesina and the campaign for food sovereignty. And the theme of food sovereignty continues throughout my work for a very good reason, because I think it offers a lot of solutions, both practical and theoretical, for the climate emergency, as Corinna very accurately puts it. But I'd like to begin my talk by acknowledging that I'm talking to you from the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, which is the coastal area we now call Sydney. And it's very pertinent to do so for this talk, because it's obviously about land. And every time we talk about food, of course, we're talking about that strong connection to land and culture. One thing about the welcome to country that not a lot of people know is that for Aboriginal people, when they welcome you to country, they're also asking why you arrive or what your purpose is. And it's been interesting in the course of starting to hear people talk about this particular book, because a lot of people have said it's made them very angry. And I'm starting to wonder whether my purpose with this book is to make people angry. It was certainly always to start a real conversation about some of the things that I think we need to question when it comes to conversations about food in the media and conversations about climate change. And a lot of, I guess, my personal motivation for writing the book was a response to a lot of the misinformation that I think is emerging about food systems. And it won't be a surprise to people at this seminar that a lot of that is generated within the context of a neoliberal food system within which we look for market-led solutions, and a lot of the responsibility falls on the consumer, and a lot of the profits tend to go to people other than consumers. But another reason why I was particularly, I guess, personally quite activated, if not angry, writing this book was because it was very much an experience of writing a book through COVID for a start. But more pertinent for us in Australia was we just had the worst bushfire season in living memory. So between October 2019 and January 2020, we had nearly 500 bushfires raging across Australia. 64 of them they could not put out. And you would have seen the images, none of which I've put in this presentation because it's actually very visceral. And we were in recovery when COVID hit, because these fires had killed 1 billion wildlife, nearly 500 people. Everyone was experiencing breathing problems because of the bushfire smoke. And I became angry because what I felt was that the bushfire event of 2019-2020 was what I call a lesson in political paralysis and policy failure. And while it incinerated some, it did not incinerate all of the doubt, apathy, and indifference about climate change that policymakers and the powerful elite in Australia and around the world still seem to possess. So coupled with the pandemic, it started to feel like collapse might have truly arrived. So the book itself, grapples with, as many of us have in our work, with this notion of crisis, which is such a common word these days. So in reality, those of us who've been studying food, we know that this is a little bit of a chronic situation rather than a crisis, because crisis, that notion suggests that this is something that will be relatively short-lived, acute, and overcome. Of course, we often hear food systems spoken about in terms of problems, and many of us in our work, and I think Jess Fanzo recently wrote about this actually in Global Food Security, it's really important to also look to food systems as sites or sources of solutions. So I try to do that in my work as well. But really, initially, I thought this idea of climate change also being a crisis overlooks the fact that this has been happening for a long time. And as Elizabeth DeLowry calls it, she says the novelty of crisis, rather than being attentive to the historical continuity of dispossession and disaster caused by empire, it shares with this notion of the food system that this is a short-lived problem that we're going to get over. Now, I think that this backstory of empire is captured really well by the work that Phil McMichael and Harriet Friedman have already done on the concept of food regimes. And I've used that theoretical framework throughout my work because I just feel it's so useful to spell out that historicity of how our food systems have evolved to the situation that they're in. And so I really wanted in the book to make sure that I didn't miss the globe, as DeLowry puts it, and I wanted to put this colonial food system at the forefront of my discussion. And in doing so, what I've done is I've brought that in conversation with the notion of the Plantationocene, which Donna Haraway describes as, a great way of amplifying the impacts of changes across populations and regions, and drawing attention to the fact that we're not all affected by climate change in the same way. And it also highlights, of course, all of those characteristics of plantation agriculture, the extraction, the exploitative labor structures, and the notion of the broadacre monoculture as well. And that's very, very sharp and very visible to me. I grew up in Queensland, which is a cane producing area along the coast. So I'm a country girl who lived on the coast, came from a family fishing business, and we were surrounded by fields of sugarcane. And growing up, it didn't seem to be obviously front and center for me, but I found out later, of course, that there was a process of slavery at work here. I'll describe it to you properly, but it was called blackbirding. So in a pattern replicated across the colonised world, the Australian sugar industry was founded on slave labour. Between 1863 and 1904, over 62,000 South Sea Islanders were tricked and kidnapped or blackbirded onto ships and transported to work in Queensland's sugar and cotton plantations. By 1908, many had been deported under the White Australia policy, which was a program to racially purify the growing Australian nation and protect white workers from the threat of cheap labour. So another reason I guess I was a bit angry writing this book was in June last year, our Prime Minister, Scott Morrison, was proud to say there'd never been slavery in Australia. So I was having quite a few angry moments last year. But what I think is very useful for the work on food systems that I'm doing in this notion of the Plantationocene is it actually really marks out what Gomez Barris calls the constraining paternalism imposed on the global South through colonising discourses and practices that continue to perceive these regions as purveyors of natural materials and undervalue the heterogeneity of life embedded within local epistemes. So another very useful framework in the book, and one that's not necessarily loved by many climate scientists, including our good friend Michael Mann, who has also, like Corinna, visited Sydney and is a great friend of the university. Michael has a problem with a lot of the discourse around collapsology, and so do I. I don't like being pessimistic and feeling as if we're going to lose everything, that collapse is inevitable. Jem Bendell, when he released this paper in 2018, it went viral very quickly, and there's been a lot written about this idea of collapse, which he defines as the end of familiar modes of sustenance, security, pleasure, identity, meaning, and hope. So yes, quite depressing. What I do really like is his deep adaptation agenda. And so what I've done is taken the 4 points that he notes and added one to those. And I must admit, the pandemic has definitely, resonated in terms of the theme of collapse. But I thought this is an interesting approach to food systems. This notion of resilience. How do we preserve and maintain the foods and foodways that we most value? And how those that will best aid our survival, given that we know our food is going to change a lot in the future. Relinquishment. What do we need to let go of in order to not to worsen human and planetary health? Restoration. What can we repair, restore, and recover in terms of ecosystems, attitudes, and beliefs about food that will help us cope with the difficulties of the future? And reconciliation. So through our foodways, how can we make peace with our losses and mistakes? How do we lessen our suffering and those of all species in the future? To those, I've added a fifth, reckoning, which is really very much the work of food activists and if you like, empty belly environmentalists and Indigenous people all around the world. This idea of how we actually acknowledge, how we own and address histories of violence and exploitation that continue to contribute to inequity in our foodways. And of course, this became very visible during the pandemic when we were looking at some of the impacts of the social structure, the social and economic structures of our food systems, where food workers in particular have been marginalised. That's something I'm going to talk about later in the presentation. So how do we respond, to climate? How do we also, respond to the pandemic? Our food choices, of course, they do matter. And I have this conversation with people a great deal, as many of us do. What is the grassroots response to these pressures? Can we vote with our forks? That's a form of small p politics, it has been called, which I think is really important. If we can afford to eat outside a corrupt system, of course we should. However, we have to acknowledge that those consumption behaviours, particularly when you're, for example, I'm living in the middle of Sydney, I'm in a 2-income household, I'm surrounded by healthy, affordable, culturally appropriate food. It's affordable for me. I have a co-op down the road, I can eat organic. A lot of people, I think, who are convinced that political consumerism is the main driver for change, forget that so many people are out of that system. In City of Sydney, we have a food insecurity rate. It was 8.5% before the pandemic. Since the pandemic, Australian food banks are reporting a doubling of the number of people who are coming for help. So even before the pandemic, 500,000 people a year were going to the month, I should say, we're going to the food bank. Therefore, again, this isn't a crisis. This is a situation of deprivation for many people. So how do we wrestle with this? Given also that the other side of the coin is the impact of food production systems, of course, on climate. And there's a lot of data that's coming thought about these impacts, which of course are very differential across production systems. So that's been the focus, obviously, of campaigns for food sovereignty and agroecology, especially, which are really coming to a head in September, of course, with the UN Food Summit, which is being organised by the World Economic Forum, and which is putting many civil society people offside, especially because we're very concerned of the co-optation of many of the solutions that are going to mitigate this fossil fuel-based food system that we're actually still using, a fossil fuel-based system that has its roots back in those colonial foodways, which used to take food back from the bread baskets, if you like, to the empire. So we clearly need to change these figures and deal with this major source of GHG emissions. We require widespread socio-economic adaptation, there is no doubt. And I put the photo of Cuba here for obvious reasons, because Cuba was actually forced to undergo this dramatic change in production systems during the special period following the collapse of the Soviet Union and the withdrawal, effectively, of all their fossil fuel and a lot of their mechanization of their agriculture. I'm not saying by any means that Cuba has the ideal food system or all the solutions, but having spent some time with actually a group of American growers in Cuba and visiting farmers, I really can see that in ingenuity and innovation, and also, of course, those very important farmers networks, the campesino networks that transfer knowledge from farmer to farmer throughout regions, that leadership was able to bring about that change in farming methods and that adaptation. So let's have a look at some of the media, obviously, that's been generated by the critiques of our food system. I'm going to draw your attention, first of all, to something that needs no introduction, an amazing report, 37 expert authors, many of whom we have read for decades, and whose work in this report is exceptional in highlighting a lot of the problems with our food systems and the need for, among many changes in land use, but also a contraction of that livestock sector, particularly that industrial livestock industry. So, you know, these are very real challenges. We know we've got a land gap because livestock obviously takes up so much land and also, of course, uses a lot of water. And this report actually attracted so much media attention that the Observer was prompted to declare that the diet wars had started. Great headlines were issued all around the world. We were being told, can we still have our burgers and, you know, save the planet, stop eating meat, full stop. I like Surgeon Captain T.L. Cleave's comment, for a modern disease to be related to an old-fashioned food is one of the most ludicrous things I've ever heard in my life. And some particularly great commentary from people ranging from Julie Blythman to a lot of the meat and livestock industry folk here in Australia as well. In response to the healthy reference diet that the Eat Lancet report recommended, of course, there was this huge backlash, a counter movement in the form of a hashtag yes to meat. And that gained sufficient strength following the issuing of the report to outnumber positive to neutral tweets under the official Eat Lancet hashtag by 10 to 1. And from a communications perspective, you know, as someone who's from that field, I found it very interesting how then the Lancet responded by saying a rapidly changing media landscape and polarization pose serious challenges to science communication on health and climate issues. And I think they raise a really good point. I'm not coming down on the side of stop eating meat, But I am acknowledging that the media can do quite a bad job of presenting these issues simply because they are so complex, and explaining to people about the fact that a low input, low emission meat production setup on marginal land can have, you know, lower impact, for example, than monoculture of almonds. It's a very complex argument that isn't as easy to spell out. So basically, you know, I in writing the book, I kept coming back to this point. This is such a distraction from the real challenges in our food systems, the issues of power, the issues of racial capitalism, the issues of marginalization of so many people in the food system, including the food insecure, across all areas of society. So we really need to change this conversation. And while we think about our consumption practices, sure, but we have to recognize that many of these, companies that control our food system are now very adeptly exploiting some of the new market niches that are arising out of the plant-based food push, as Joanna Blythman puts it. So let's have a little look at the political economy of the food system, which again is no mystery to many of you. We know that Tyson, Nestle and Cargill produce emissions to rival those of fossil fuel companies, and the top 20 global meat producers collectively emit more GHGs than Germany. So there's a lot of great research on this, particularly from grain. JBS of Brazil, Tyson in the US, and WH Group of China dominate meat and dairy, controlling 63% of pork packing, 46% of beef, 38% of poultry, in an oligopoly defined as a market where 4 firms control 40% or more of sales. So we have still these problems. These problems persist. And here we have as Raj Patel calls it, the hourglass, where we've got millions of producers, a bottleneck where people are squeezing profit from farmers, and then we've got millions of consumers. And of course, this globalization of our food system has changed the face of obesity. A lot of the references I use in the book are well known to many of you. I talk about the transition in Mexico's foodways, but also Brazil's, and also the impact of soy production, which is largely fueling the pork boom in China, the impacts of that on environments in both countries, including, an eutrophic dead zone in the East China Sea, not unlike the dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. So the costs of a poor diet are well known to many of you at this presentation, and of course the rise of retail, which has also been tracked by a number of people whose excellent work I refer to in the book, including Jennifer Clapp's work on this is brilliant. The idea of, you know, the big supermarket, the big retailer. We have a duopoly in Australia, so we're very alert to this. We've got 2 main supermarkets, Coles and Woolworths, and they have already been charged under the Grocery Code of Conduct for pushing marketing costs back onto farmers. We've also got processors who are playing a big role in keeping dairy prices down. But this notion of Walmart capitalism is so called because it actually now has more power than any other body to legislate key components of Australian social and industrial policy. And the person who I quote in the book, who I think really drives this home in her description, is Davida Davison, who at the University of Sydney, with a number of colleagues, I've had the great opportunity and honour to work with Davida, and we've actually started a Food Lab Sydney, which has been running now, it's in its 3rd year, which is basically food kitchen business incubator, early start incubator, which enables people to basically start from zero in terms of getting a food idea for a product or something to do with might be a cafe or a restaurant, but a very diverse group of people with great ideas. And the whole idea is that they follow some good food principles that make sure that they're conducting business in a way that, you know, demonstrates respect not just for food but also for employees and for eaters. And Davita's really using this term food apartheid very appropriately. She doesn't use the words food desert. She talks about food apartheid, meaning that neighborhoods and communities in the city of Detroit and communities occupied with Black and brown bodies all over the country, they live under food apartheid. She talks about a desert being a natural phenomenon, but having a lack of access to fresh, healthy, affordable food is not natural, nor is it accidental. And listening to the previous Food Thinkers speaker, Tamara Soma, it was amazing to hear how she talked about that in her food assets mapping, about the fact that urban planning plays such an important role in people's access to healthy, affordable food. And what this tells us is something that people like Karina and people in public health have been telling us forever, is that framing citizens as consumers and placing responsibilities on individuals obscures the extent to which governments sustain unsustainable economic institutions and ways of life, and the extent to which they have a hand in structuring options and possibilities. That's Elizabeth Shrove there, talking about the ABC, the attitudes, behaviour, choice model, because we all know that we're not making great decisions when we go to the supermarket. We're usually going there between work and home, or school and home. And, you know, we're not thinking very rationally, or I'm not, just before dinner. So, you know, this is not a useful framework. The other thing that became startling during the pandemic, particularly in the US, was the way that the beef and pork and poultry industrial setups in companies in the US were bleating about how they were so essential to the nation's food security, when they are the sites of some of the biggest bads, if you like, in terms of racial capitalism. So the entire food supply chain marginalizes people on the basis of race and gender. Reading about what happens in Georgia in particular was quite startling, especially the low rates of pay, but even more so, there was a conversation happening at the same time. I've since heard that this bill has been knocked back, but they were trying to increase the rate of processing poultry in the plants from 140 birds per minute up to 225 birds per minute, which is the unregulated rate in China. So while COVID was going on, industries were trying to, if you like, speed up the production line. So yes, worker organising, it was fascinating doing some research on that, led by mostly Black women who represented those getting banged around the most. And what was really devious was, of course, once Black and Hispanic women realised that they were experiencing the same problems, and once they got together, the companies divided them by getting rid of undocumented workers. So at every point, it's an amazing story of a social struggle, a struggle for basic rights and against sexual harassment and other horrors. So in doing this particular, thinking, I've drawn a lot on Tim Peixeira's work, which is excellent. This book he wrote based on going undercover for 6 months in a Nebraska slaughterhouse where he worked on the killing floor. And I think the way he draws a comparison between the dehumanization of the beast that is being processed and the dehumanization of the worker is, some of the most brilliant work that's been done on certainly industrial meat. He uses this fantastic term, the fabrication department, which we see all the time operating in industrial food. In all political processes where the unacceptable must be rendered acceptable, where the morally and physically disgusting must be made digestible, fabrication departments literal and allegorical, perform a dual work on construction and manufacture, and of framing forgery and the invention of lies. So basically, while the well-publicised violence of industrial killing is alienating eaters, the giants of the meat industry are now reinventing themselves as protein producers by moving into plant-based and cellular meat production. Many of you will be familiar with this. This was the only part of the book where the editor asked me to go back and check several times for legals. I was talking about Tyson, who it is in the public record that they have fines for violating the Clean Water Act for knowingly dumping waste from a chicken processing plant into a Missouri river. They have an independent farm animal welfare advisory panel, which has been described as strategic and superficial, and makes for good publicity, but offers little hope for real improvements in animal well-being. They're an easy target, but particularly so when they move into this new plant-based protein or blended meats market. They've got a range called Raised and Rooted, which is a really funny name when you live in Australia, but I won't go into that here for the Australians in the audience. Enjoy that. But what I found, it was very interesting what Noel White, the CEO, said when he was questioned, because Beyond Meat in particular, they received a lot of criticism when Tyson initially invested in their alternative meat products. Once they divested and out of Beyond Meats, Tyson started their own label, Raised and Rooted. And when challenged on this, Beyond Meat said, well, we like Tyson because, you know, they know how to move the lever. We're working with them because we want to disrupt the industry. But it becomes really clear when you hear this statement. The CEO of Tyson says, for us, this is about and not or. We remain firmly committed to our growing our traditional meat business and expect to be a market leader in alternative protein, which is experiencing a double-digit growth and could someday be $1 billion business for our company. So they're actually not self-disrupting by investing in plant-based meat products, but rather, as Lenore Newman says, making bets on where the commodities will go next. And I think this is an extremely important point that we need to think about when we're considering introducing these particular alternative proteins into our diets. And in September 2019, Tyson's also moving into the seafood replacement market with New Wave Foods, which plans to have a shrimp-ready alternative for food service operators in early 2020. So it is a cliche, but a lot of people are drinking the Kool-Aid, certainly, you know, in the media. And again, I'm putting this sort of media comms lens on this as well, and thinking, you know, how amazing it is to come up with these techno-fixes for so many things. It's reminiscent of climate smart agriculture. Now we have the climate smart food. And Thomas Pause does a lot of great work on this. He talks about it in terms of headless material activism. And he talks about the way that this activism, like magic tricks, leaves us with a sense of childish enchantment while missing what is really at stake. So again, the real question is, what are the current and emergent technologies involved? Many of them have likely got applications for our food systems in the future, particularly in addressing lack of nutrition and food insecurity. But really, we've got to question who's controlling them. And, you know, we know that obviously we're further distanced also from the origins of our food and from our food cultures by a lot of these quick fixes, which I have fun describing in the book because some of them are very wild. So, you know, what is the role of myth making and narrative design in this substitution movement? And here, you know, looking at plant-based milks was also very instructive, because milk has literally moved from the original superfood, you know, replete with calcium, protein and vitamins, to scary dairy, catastrophic for both animals and the environment. And plant-based milks are really at the vanguard of this clean eating craze, which also makes me slightly crazy, where, you know, what Instagrammers have managed to do, what what vegan activists have been trying to do forever, all of a sudden they've made, giving up milk more than just a health issue. It's part of living your best and beautiful life, which is part of the pursuit of wellness, which is now, of course, a multi-million-dollar industry populated by health fixes, ranging from Gwyneth's Goop to Soul Cycle and all other sorts of lifestyle changes. So these sorts of foods really exploit this shift to functional nutritionism, which again has been studied a lot by an Australian colleague who wrote a book about it. Georgi Skirins talks about the way that these techniques re-engineer the nutritional profile of food and give companies the opportunity to market the precise health benefits of food. Now, I've only got 4 minutes left, and I'm really conscious I want lots of questions, so I'm going to zip through the next bit, but I'm going to conclude on the very important point that we don't need new products, we need a new paradigm. While low and no meat diets reduce pressure on lands and hopefully generate more crops with nitrogen fixing potential, they rely more on bees, for example, and they have big impacts on diversity and freshwater ecosystems. So we need to look carefully at the production systems. It has been said in the US, considering that colony collapse disorder is becoming more and more of a problem, and also, the shipping of bees around the country, which is also happening here in Australia now, is resulting in many casualties. So a lot of the beekeepers talk about it as sending bees to war. Many of them don't come back. And if we think about, replacements for bees, then we're ignoring the entire problem, of course. So basically, and I'm quoting from Thomas Pause again here, the idea of substitutions is to comfort the consumer by creating the perfect substitute so we can keep eating burgers and chicken without having to suffer from a change in taste or texture. The power of these substitutions is they don't have to be presented as a massive cultural change or a nudge to operate. But isn't meat production a symptom of a wider malaise in society? And if that symptom disappears, what happens to the roots of the problem? Now, given that a lot of us are talking about food and food is becoming much more a topic, pardon the pun, of dinner conversation, there is now hope that we've got this pivotal moment in the long food movement. And I was delighted to receive this from Phil McMichael earlier this year, a great publication by Pat Mooney and other authors at IPES Food and the ETC group, talking about this notion of a long food movement, where it's a great article which tracks the future of food if we go down agribusiness as usual path compared to reclamation of food systems by civil society and social movements, by farmers and fishers groups, cooperatives and unions. What do those two futures look like? I really recommend that everybody read that particular article or report. So, maybe we're actually starting to understand the importance of changing our food ways. Certainly a big part of that is, as Julie Guthman says, resisting the neoliberal idolatry of the market, which is such a great statement. So if we regulate through market choice, we ignore the fact that many of the people who bring us the healthy food cannot afford to eat that product. So people producing organics or, for example, not being able to actually eat the food that they grow. And it becomes clear that we need to look at these socioeconomic inequalities more broadly. Great example, of course, of grassroots action is the Coalition of Immokalee Workers, which has managed to get better conditions for pickers in Florida especially, and they consolidated the Alliance for Fair Food, which has been called the David versus Goliath triumph, a scalable model and leverage point to gain human working conditions and a 70% increase in wages for those pickers who are largely Hispanic. And in Australia, we're fighting our own battles. Another part of this puzzle is actually stopping taking fossil fuels out of the ground. So the GATE Alliance in Australia, has joined what Naomi Klein and others call the Blockadia movement, which is really uniting landowners, farmers, Indigenous people, First Nations people in frontline coalitions, opposing some of the idiocy that we see certainly in Australia when it comes to removing, coal, and now fracking, which is having a major impact on our food bowls. We know the secrets as scholars of food systems. We need to resist conventionalisation. So we need to really do the things that the food labs are doing, do the things that the agroecological farmers are doing, which is think differently and also beware of co-optation. And that's going to be on the agenda firmly leading up to the UN Food Summit. And I'm leaving you with a quote from Wendell Berry, which I think sums up exactly the theme of my work at the moment. Epic feats of engineering require only a few brilliant technicians and a lot of money. But feeding a world of people year to year for a long time requires cultures of husbandry fitted into the nature of millions of unique small places, precisely the kinds of cultures that industrialism has purposely disvalued, uprooted, and destroyed. So thank you very much for allowing me to tell you about my work tonight, this afternoon.
Great, thank you very much, Alana. That was a very clear sense of some of the big perspectives and the deeper issues that underpin the commonly proposed solutions. So thank you very much for laying that out so clearly and colourfully for us. Thank you very much indeed. So we'll get right into the questions then. So I'm going to start with the first one. I know that you're part of Food Lab Sydney. I think that's right. And the first question comes from Usman, and he says, I think Usman is a guy's name, forgive me if it isn't, it says, do we think that initiatives like food labs in Sydney or in Detroit or the other places where they've been developed offer new business models that challenge both conventional approaches to mass food production, but also some of the historical injustices that you described at the beginning? So they're more than commercial innovations, they tackle a range of social issues. So it'd be good to kind of get a sense from you about what a food lab really is and how you see it, because it is one of those things that could be construed to be something very, very techy.
Yeah, no, an excellent question, and something that we're finding out actually through the research we're doing with Food Lab. How does it work most effectively as an intervention in food insecurity? And what we realized really quickly was we're talking more about individual change because we're dealing with relatively small groups of people, but how do the ripples of those good food practices that they do in their enterprises impact on the wider food system? So it is a different way of working, and it's more of you've still got to make profit. So you're still talking about doing business in the context of the local economy, but what we're talking about is purpose alongside profit, which has been one of the really great learnings we've got from Davida at Food Lab Detroit, which is you need to do food differently, and you need to go beyond the notion of the triple bottom line, which everybody talks about now. You need to think about, how you actually, for example, a lot of our participants, they're working on food waste, because we see so much of that, as Carolyn Steele says, and I know everyone quotes her because she just does such amazing work, but the food system's so big we only see the end. So we see the end in the city, and dealing with waste has been something that we're seeing a lot of our participants focus on. So I went to a 3-course meal the other night just across the road that one of our participants had put on. All of the food was sourced from Ubi, which collects food from people, leftover food sharing, and absolutely delicious, very healthy, vegetarian, vegan in fact, and very tasty. And it's not about making, for our participants, it's not about making a lot of money, but admittedly for a lot of our participants, it is about getting a job. So I think that the Food Lab needs to cater for individual needs, because many of the people doing it, they're looking at pivoting from one career to another, and they're relatively affluent, if I can say that. Others are actually looking to get an entry point into, you know, their first job after long-term employment. We've got people doing the program who've been homeless. We've got people doing the program who've got 2 degrees and have worked in the city. And it's really great having that diversity. And in terms of economic models, we do a lot of talk about circular economy and solidarity economies. And also a lot of the people, interestingly enough, who come to Food Lab are people who are already running community supported agriculture setups, or they're doing their own food relief activities in their communities. And it was really interesting during COVID to see some of those people really step in and fill the gap where we needed it on a local neighbourhood level.
Great, thank you for that. And I'm going to follow with another big question that might require quite a long answer, or perhaps a very, very short one, which is Yana asks, is a sustainable food shift possible within neoliberalism? I think probably what lies behind that question is the, if I can just illustrate, Yana hasn't said this is my spin on it, but if we're talking about really major transformative shifts in the food system to more sustainability, can we really rely on these smaller things like food labs or things which are very place-based or perhaps smaller scale to then coalesce and add up and make a transformative shift? Or do we actually just need to say we need to change neoliberalism and then maybe we'll get the sustainable food shift?
I think predictably I'm going to say we need to do it all. I think that having it visible gives you in your local community, and seeing a diversity in the food system locally is really important to keep you focused on the prize. You know, Anna Holt Singh, who I talk about in the book, talks about it. You know, many of you will have read The Mushroom at the End of the World. And she talks about, you know, tracing the journey of the Matsuki mushroom and all the niches of where life flourishes despite capitalism. And I think that, you know, that might sound a little bit Pollyanna-ish, but the fact is there are a lot of good things happening that are working within the market. And I think we need to support those things. And we need to also work on a large scale change, because we know that these big policies and the corporate influence in the food system is going to be the major shift that we need. What we do need is the political will. And again, I think that comes back to the grassroots, comes back to people, you know, voting. We've had a lot of conversations about this at my book launch. Someone said, do you have, you know, what politicians do you have faith in Australia for changing this? And I said, well, I don't actually think either of the two parties is offering any solution on climate change at the moment. However, what I do really believe in is independence and people who are willing to stand up and do things. We have one here in Australia, and he was trying to get a bill passed whereby when you went into a restaurant, you had a right to find out where the fish was sourced. And it didn't get passed. And I think that's one of the first things. We need information as eaters. We need to stop being treated like consumers, and we need to start being treated like citizens, and we need information about the food system. So I think that the role of the food labs and the role of the ethical, sustainable producers and the ethical and sustainable retailers is paramount, because what they're doing is they're also not only selling you healthy, affordable, well, not necessarily affordable, but very healthy food, they are actually educating people and sharing the stories of the good things that are happening, including the regen farmers. I think of my great friends, Laura and Grant, who have an ethical butchery, Feather and Bone, and their aim is to make us eat less meat. They just want us to eat better meat. and when people, comment on the affordability or lack of affordability of their products, they say, well, how often do you need to eat meat? I think that we can work towards a better future within the neoliberal model, and I think that we have to engineer the shift from the top and the bottom, and we have to keep that utopian view in our sights as well, that we're going to actually do the economy differently, because I agree that is a major sticking point.
Yeah, it's like you have to do something, right? So
Yeah.
and there's a role for all of us and the things that we can do, and there are different entry points. But building on that, Nadine asked a question about could you elaborate a bit more on then what needs to be done to shape food systems towards sustainability? I mean, you've said you've got the smaller scale things and the committed people, and then you've got the larger scale kind of changes to the economy. Could you just say a bit more about what perhaps some of your priority things would be, or on the pathway towards change? And she said specifically considering who has the most power.
Who has the most power? Yeah. Well, it goes back to, and I bang on about this quite a lot in, voice and participation, definitely. I think that the biggest danger is one that everybody recognises at the moment. I think all the political economists, that the danger of the depoliticisation of some of the solutions that the people's movements have is a real problem, because if the methods of managing food in an agroecological way are adopted by the corporates, they will depoliticize it, which means that they will not consider who is marginalized in food systems. They might just take those new technologies and, as has been said, add them to the industrial toolbox. So I think what we need to make sure is that the people who are representing, and this has been happening through the civil society mechanism, of course, at the World Committee for Food Security since 2009, the civil society mechanisms has made huge inroads in getting agroecology on the agenda. I remember people saying back in 2005, 2006, well, it's food sovereignty, what's that? What are you talking about? I remember being at FAO and talking to people who on one side of the hallway talking about food security, on the other talking about food sovereignty. And it was almost like the food security people still did not understand the value of that concept. I feel like there's been a shift in terms of certainly a lot of decision making that's reflected in that change of the Committee for World Food Security. What really, really worries me is now this shift back to the World Economic Forum controlling it. And unfortunately, I feel like the pandemic's almost given governments license to kind of retreat back and actually lose a lot of that nuance that we were starting to get in the conversation, because I really, really think it is about giving the voice to the people who are growing the food in sustainable ways, and also the people who are at the pointy end of climate change too, quite frankly, because these are going to be the people who feel the impacts of climate change long before those of us in a position of privilege are.
And loads of questions here. So another one that you referred to changes in production there. Jean asks, and thanks you for your brilliant presentation. What are the big shifts in food production that you are really hopeful for? Is it about moving towards agroecology? I know that's more about than just production, but what are the big shifts in food production that you want to see?
Yeah, I want to see, and I got an interesting response to this. I was on a panel at the Dairy Sustainability Summit in Melbourne last week, and talking from a social science perspective. It was really interesting because I made a major faux pas. I mentioned the possibility of contracting exports, and oh my goodness, the reaction I got was overwhelming. But I actually think that countries like Australia, there's a discourse here about the fact that we're the breadbasket of the world. I've actually heard people say that again. I think this idea of certain places as, you know, as if Australia is the salvation of at least Southeast Asia, that's not the fact. A lot of our food practices are deeply destructive. One of the cases I talk about in the book is our Pacific neighbours. So not only are they on the front line of climate change because sea levels are rising, they also get all the fatty offcuts of meat from Australia and New Zealand. Their diets are terrible, and they've also got offshore fishing fleets coming in and taking, you know, their natural foodways away from them. So I think we need to look really hard at ourselves and think, let's stop some of those really destructive practices. Let's think about how we create local, resilient food systems where we don't leave any of our own citizens behind, but let's also stop a lot of those very damaging practices like food dumping, for example, that undercut other markets. And I think looking carefully at, yes, the profile of our exports, especially in countries like Australia, where, for example, you know, at the moment, we're having a trade war with China, as seems to be the trend lately. And 94% of our lobsters go to China. And that means that you can buy a lobster here for $10. Yet I know that Aboriginal people are being criminalised for harvesting, or if you like, gathering lobsters and selling them to local restaurants. And I just don't see the logic in this. I do not see why that huge lucrative business should be more important than the livelihoods of local people. So some of those changes, and I'm not an economist, and I'm not anti-trade, but I'm certainly looking at a different way of trading, because I think that those sorts of drivers, they govern a lot of the land use. We can see that. So if we can be much more equitable in our consideration of trade, I think that's a really, really important first step.
Thanks. Yeah, big issues, and building on that, William makes a very good point here, which is talks about the large traders of the major commodities, the large agribusinesses, and about the role that they play. And he says, how do we pressure for adoption of values of sustainability to these multinationals operating in a regulatory governance poor countries? But interestingly, he points something out, which is something I've often noted, and I'm sure others have as well, and it comes up a lot in the trade space. It came up very recently in an exchange I was having about the use of terminology. So one of the world's leading agribusinesses, Cargill, has it on its website, and this is what William points out in his question: our purpose is to be the leader in nourishing the world in a safe, responsible and sustainable way. It's who we are, it's why we exist. As the world faces extraordinary challenges from climate change to food insecurity, delivering on our purpose is more critical than ever before. And another one, Louis Dreyfus, is committed to working towards a safe and sustainable future, and so on. So the words are there. The words are there by these large agribusiness. We see it across the piece in lots of different spaces where the words sustainable food systems have, before they were hippie terms, now they're widely adopted. And it means that large agribusinesses are adopting. And for some people, that's like, this is great because they're changing their practices. And for other people, it's like, this is this greenwashing and it's not whatever, superficial washing. So how do we deal with this issue that the whole notions of what we're talking about are being adopted, and some people think that's good and some people think it's bad? I'm not going to make a judgment, but what's your view on how we address that? It's tricky.
It is very tricky, and I think that it's really clear with, you know, those statements from those companies, they chill me. It's like the first time I heard Archer Daniels Midland's aspiration to be supermarket to the world. Like, that just doesn't make me comfortable. basically, because again, it shows that we become dependent. We become dependent on these big companies, but in ways that we don't even know, because we don't even understand how so many of these commodities go into our food. I think one of the problems, of course, is this commodification of food to the extent that it's indistinguishable from other industrial products. And the fact that these companies do have huge amounts of discretionary money to run these marketing campaigns, which far exceed, again, the budgets of the companies that are selling the food that isn't ultra processed, again, gives them a huge advantage. I think that when it comes to the sustainability claims, we just need to really interrogate them. We need to keep them very honest. And this is really problematic because, as everyone from Marion Nestle to Hilal Elva, former UN Special Rapporteur for the Right to Food, she did an investigation into pesticides, as we know, and she talked about how there's a revolving door in the US between the executives in pesticide companies and big life science companies like, the usual suspects, and government. So basically, the lobbying is also so powerful that, really key documents like the Farm Bill are actually designed to prop up these unsustainable companies. So it's almost like the greenwashing is almost after the fact. I think it's it's literally the way that business has been so closely implicated with government that it means that you don't actually have any transparency around so many of the practices that are happening. And, this is where, as Pasheray says, the fabrication department comes into play. It's really the job of a lot of people working in these companies, especially in marketing comms, which I've worked in. It's their job to cover up a lot of really ugly practices. I've never had to do that. I'm really glad.
Well, it's building on this issue around what can be considered more mainstream adoption of these ideas. Stuart makes the point about the UN Food Systems Summit. And he says he considers that paradigm is an anti-ethical to the comprehensive approach to addressing the challenges that you raise. I don't know whether you've been how closely you've been following to the UN Food Systems Summit, but what's your view? Do you think there's anything that can be done to address what Stuart views as a problem
in terms of those people having the decision-making power?
In terms of the UN Food Systems Summit, maybe taking an approach which is not amenable to the approach that we've been proposing in addressing the challenge.
Well, I do think that there's a big reason to be worried about it, and again, other people have raised this, is that the Secretary General Special Envoy is the president of the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa. And I think that shows that the Bill and Melinda Gates strategy is going to be applied. So it's going to be more of a green revolution approach, basically. And we know that what they have done, Tim Wise has written a lot about this, has been unsuccessful in lifting, the 30 million small-scale farmer households in Africa that they were committed to raising our poverty. That's failed on its own terms. And one of the real reasons is that they've replaced a lot of climate-resistant crops like millet with agri-sponsored, corporate-sponsored crops. And so, unfortunately, I'm really worried that the summit is going to really undermine that hard-won democratic space that the CSM has created, and also, give farmers again this, and governments in the global south, this Faustian bargain where they basically have to, sign up to not only food aid, but these crops. these seed packages, etc., which has been, you know, that short tether approach has been proved to be absolutely devastating, because not only does it have a big impact on water systems, a lot of those crops that aren't designed for those particular climates and local realities, but it also, of course, creates conflict between farmers on local and regional level, the haves and the have-nots. So it's really a battle between two paradigms, really. And I think that we really need to be prepared to defend the fact that the only way we're going to have transformative change is through basing food systems on principles like diversity, agroecology, and human rights. And I just don't think that they are on the agenda of these corporations, because they don't want to share the profits.
Well, just to let the audience know that one of our food thinkers, I think it was back in February, was Agnes Kalibata, who you just referred to, who's the president of the African Green Revolution in Africa. We have a lot of diverse voices. That's really important to us at Food Thinkers. So that'll be online if you really want to, if you'd like to listen what Agnes had to say about the summit and other things. And thanks very much for that response, Alana. Just shifting gears to a couple of questions more on the citizen side. Joanna asked the question, what are some ways that we can strengthen food literacy, or, as you suggest, the knowledge and power of food citizens?
Very important project. And, you know, I look with great envy at your curriculum. I'd like to do your master's course myself, Corinna. I've got many, many friends and colleagues who've done it. I would love to have something like that at University of Sydney. And interestingly enough, I'm having a meeting next week with a dear friend who actually happens to be CEO of the Aboriginal Carbon Foundation. He's going to come and talk to me and a few colleagues about how we actually integrate some of that knowledge into our curriculums. And I think it's the same with food, and it's the same with other things that are happening at the moment. We need to embed them in the teaching that we do at all levels. And I think we always say that we want students to be critical thinkers, but again, that means giving them access to all those different points of view. So I think that, you know, our education systems need to be infused with a lot of these principles, and a lot of these debates need to be introduced to people at an early age. I think, you know, again, another reason for optimism is young people are responding strongly to climate. I think the important thing is that, again, they don't get misinformation about the solution to the problems, because there's a lot of misinformation out there. So the role of the media and the role of the education system is immense, you know. And I don't want to demonize social media, and I use it myself, but again, you know, we've got to ensure that people grow up realizing that the internet is not necessarily the bearer of all truth, and we need to encourage people to be looking at deeper sources of information. And to be frank, that was one reason why I was so glad that Emerald, you know, Jen McCall, wonderful editor, said to me, can you write something about food? It's in this Society Now series, and it's designed for a wider readership. And I was just delighted, because I thought a small paperback, relatively short, mind you, it's got, and people have commented on this, 64 pages of references in it, in a, you know, 240-page book. But there's a reason for that. I said, there is so much great research and so many amazing conversations happening about food, and we really need to bring a broader audience into this conversation, because we all eat. So it was great to do a crossover book, and something that I really would like to do more of.
Sure. Well, there is the second question I was going to ask on this side is also about the education, system specifically. And the question from Suzanne is, how do you feel the education system can be involved? So perhaps you could give some more details, but she's specifically talking about school children and school-aged children, saying that they can be valid part of the change. They can push their parents in a better direction. They can support in schools, they can gain skills, and schools can be role models, and they can be role models. So what are there some very specific asks that you have of the education system as it pertains to school children?
Absolutely. And I think schools are a really important part of our food system as well. And this is coming up all the time. You know, it goes beyond having a, you know, a school garden or a community garden. It goes to what you're feeding people at school and what people can buy at school. Because I think that, you know, again, that's why food is such a great lens for talking about so many of these issues. And you know, looking at the what our cafeterias, you know, sell at schools. You know, I've always been, when I first went to the UK, I was actually a high school teacher, and I taught in a lot of London schools especially, and I couldn't believe I was getting this fantastic lunch every day. Like, honestly, especially for someone who was traveling and didn't have much money anyway, I was just loving this hot lunch at lunchtime. And it really made me look critically at Australia's, you know, school food system, because I also taught in Australia. And I remember with a number of teachers, we started a breakfast club because we had kids who were coming to school without breakfast, and without fail, they were always, you know, demob happy by 11 a.m. and they couldn't learn. And it was because they weren't eating properly, you know, and a lot of that wasn't necessarily their parents' fault. You know, I worked in Gladstone, very industrial area, big alumina plant, and a lot of shift workers and people who didn't actually, you know, weren't there to get up with their kids and get them off to school with a proper breakfast. And I think that, you know, again, if you grow up in a really healthy food environment, you're gonna want to hang on to that. You know, again, I was lucky. I grew up in a family fishing business, and I couldn't get out the door in the morning without eating some sort of seafood. And I look back now and I think, oh my goodness, that was amazing. And it came straight out of the ocean where we lived. It didn't come from overseas. Like 70% of Australian seafood is imported. So yes, I'm a bit passionate about fish. I'm going to tune into the next talk, definitely.
Yeah, please do. For anyone who missed it, it's on June the 29th with Christina Hicks, who knows a lot about seafood. So you also mentioned that the media system, Rebecca's got a question, and she wonders whether you think there's a role for encouraging the media to take a more systemic approach to the way that they cover food, as you know, and certainly in the Western media, and I think throughout the world, they'll cover like particular things about ingredients and new food products and sort of sensationalist headlines around various topics, but don't tend to really kind of communicate the complexity of the systems, as you might imagine from the modern media. But how can the media do better, do you think?
Well, it's a really good question, and a great initiative has stemmed out of a lot of the work that's going on in the US. Bon Appetit magazine, for example. Some people might be following that debate where people are looking really critically at food journalism, especially in the US, and saying, you know, who's being featured again? Where are the voices of the people doing the innovative work? Where are the voices of the people in color? And where are the exposés of some of the exploitation that happens in kitchens all over the world? Where is that appearing? So people are really starting to challenge that dominant narrative that's been in the media about food, which has been sort of, if you like, you know, quite cosmetic, I think, and superficial, and again, more, you know, locked into that, you know, living your best life kind of model, as opposed to serious investigative reporting that really represents what's happening in the ground, what's wrong with the food system, and also giving people who've previously been marginalized in that system a platform on which to talk about the things that are wrong about it and how we're going to change them as eaters and as food preparers and as food producers. What really worries me is, like our supermarket you know, system in Australia, we've got a really concentrated media market, and I'm really concerned about media diversity, not just because of food, but because of a whole range of other issues. Because, you know, unfortunately, the Murdoch press is really big on climate change denial still, and a lot of the problems I think that we've had, you know, I've noticed it with Food Lab, getting good news stories about positive things that are happening that show the diversity and the, if you like, energy and the leadership that's coming from local communities in food systems is not really getting talked about, because, you know, we're getting, and I used to work, you know, for the Sydney Morning Herald, so Fairfax Media was our only independent media organisation in Australia. And unfortunately, the days I worked there were past, because journalists used to get longer to write stories, longer to do investigative reporting, and more resources. So I think that we need to worry about, corporate capture of media as well as corporate capture of food systems. There's definitely a pattern.
Following up on this, thank you. Following up on this issue about how you communicate this, Lynn's got an interesting question about the fact that production technologies being complex and not easily communicated to the public, and science, overall scientific processes are difficult to communicate to the public, and there's prone to, as you indicated, a huge amount of misinformation. And she gives some examples about plant-based meats and others about like how do you communicate this in a way that reflects this kind of depth of understanding and investigation that's really required, when it's actually genuinely difficult to communicate these things. They are genuinely hard to communicate.
It really is. I think that's been a big challenge with climate change, and I think governments have lots of problems communicating it. Renewables, for example, and again, it's technology. I found it really interesting looking at things like cell cultured meat and all those meat mimics, and looking at how they're produced and explaining the differential impacts of those different production processes. And I think that there are a number of really key messages that we need to get out when it comes to food in a changing climate, not only about production systems needing to undergo a fundamental change and listening to the traditional knowledge of people whose foodways we've marginalised, like Indigenous people and First Nations people and traditional farmers as well. What we really need to do is get a message out to people that a lot of the technologies and the geoengineering that's planned to solve our problems in the future is not going to work if it's not decarbonised. So I think there's really a big primary message that we need to get out across all aspects of life, really, which is that we actually need to decarbonise our energy systems, and we need to be positive about new technologies that are generating energy and fuel for the future in different ways. We've got a fabulous project in South Australia, for example, called Sundrop Farms, which is hectares of solar, growing tomatoes, and desalinating seawater at the same time. So actually producing energy and producing consumable water. So, why don't those things get more visibility? It's a matter of, I think, telling stories. I think people love the stories of successful individuals and startups, especially when they're close to home. And I think that that's something Australia doesn't do very well, is tell the really good stories of our entrepreneurs, which is why many of them leave, because with promotion and visibility comes investment. So I think that the whole, I know storytelling is a bit of a catch cry at the moment, but it's true. We only really engage when we feel that there's a narrative and some sort of outcome that mobilizes us then to do something about it. And I think that food and climate are just two of the issues where we need to do that communication a lot better.
Sure. Well, we've only got a few minutes left and we've still got a ton of questions. So unfortunately, I'm not going to be able to ask them all. But I did want to pick up on that point you just made about carbon, and I suppose this is a source of a story if it's done right. But Gilles asked, could you tell us if you think carbon accounting in food value chains could be a solution to put at least more transparency around the issue, so that could be communicated?
Yeah, I do. I think that it's a bit like putting calories on menus. It at least makes you think about it. Even if it's not the most it's not the most elegant tool, it actually makes people think about it. Offsetting your flights, things like that. It just brings it into your vision that this is an important issue that we all need to work on. And, you know, and that's multi-scalar. We need to work on it as individuals, and we need to work on it as business owners, and we need to work on it as governments and citizens. We need to be focused on it, because it's the thing we've got in common. And that's the thing about the great thing about climate change. It just shows you that, you know, we're all in the same boat to an extent, but of course we're not, which my book's all about. We're not all in the same boat. So we need to again think about, you know, who is left out of that story when we make these technological advancements, because there's a lot of things we need to fix up. We can't just I guess prioritize some of these immediate threats, given that we have such long-standing inequities in food systems already. We need to fight all the battles at the same time, really.
So last couple of minutes, 2 questions, so please try and answer them as fast as you can. But I've got to ask this one by Karina. I'm not quite sure if I understood the question, but I've got to ask it because it's World Bee Day today, which I just love the idea there's a World Bee Day.
Oh.
There's so many issues around bees at the moment which are not great. But she says, regenerative livestock and poultry can't cover increasing demand. So for them to be sustainable, we need to decrease demand for meat. But then she says, if you reduce demand for meat, it puts extra load on pollinators, which are in shorter supply. So what's the right way to go? Probably not a good question to answer in 30 seconds, but I did want to highlight the question and thank Karina for her question.
Really good question. Again, I think we need to look at where these changes are happening. Like, yes, you know, I think 5% of people in the UK are now vegan, so they're eating less meat. Americans still eat way too much meat. Australians still eat way too much meat. We're eating less, and we're certainly including more plants in our diets. But if we look at the countries that are increasing meat consumption, it's where we've got the emerging middle class. And so we've got more meat consumption, certainly in China, and certainly in Brazil. And it's those big patterns of meat consumption. As you know, I love the term the vector of meatification, whereby, you know, your particular affluence, you know, is linked to the amount of meat that you can consume. And yes, you know, you've hit the nail on the head with bees, and, you know, go bees, World Bee Day. I'm so delighted to hear that. They are actually, you know, the bellwethers or the canaries in the coal mine. So yeah, we know that we're in trouble because bees are in trouble. So we need to actually stop those polluting industrial monocultures that strip, you know, the land of biodiversity. And we need to look at growing those crops in more biodiverse systems. And again, you know, around the world, there are a lot of farmers already doing that. And a lot of them are members of La Via Campesina. And I just say to anybody who wants to know more about these sorts of systems and the things that are going on in the world, go to their website, because they're amazing, and they've been around, you know, small scale peasant farming movement since 1993. They're here to stay, and I hope that they are one day going to be the biggest voice in food and agriculture policy, because I think that they represent the people who we need to focus on in a lot of these debates, and they're the people least responsible for emissions production.
Okay, great. I'm just going to pose a question. I'm going to ask you not to answer it because we are, in fact, 1 minute over time. But Tamrin says that many people aren't thinking the way that you're thinking and what you've presented to us today. And governments creating regulations are not thinking about this. And so I'll just end with her question about what steps can be taken to start getting governments and others to shift their thinking about appropriate solutions. Unfortunately, there's no time to answer that, but I did want to pose the question because I think it's a really important one. And there are also some other fabulous questions, which perhaps, if you wouldn't mind, perhaps those can, if you want to, they want to be asked one-to-one, they could perhaps find you over email. But I you know, it's obviously a key point that Tamrin makes about exactly what government regulations and policies we need that we haven't touched on. But that's one to think about, and for us all to think about, because I do want to end, albeit 2 minutes over time. And just thank you very much for answering all of those questions and really engaging them with deeply. Thank you to our audience for posing such fantastic questions and for your deep engagement with what Alana has said, which is what these food thinkers are all about. And thank you very much, Alana, for your talk and inspiring us to think bigger and think in an ambitious way, but also think practically about what's possible and what we can do, and to be inspired ourselves by the different activities that are going on around the world to try and make effective change against a changing climate and problems that we face in our food systems. So
thanks, Corinna. Thank you, everybody.
And I hope you managed to get a good night's sleep tonight after your very early. So thank you very much.
No problem.
For all the participants. Thank you. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.